In 1993, wizards entered Gen Con and emerged with hordes of treasure. They had been seen, they had amazed, but they had also walked into the very den of an old and powerful entity, an entity that was itself synonymous with hordes of treasure, and like Smaug of Tolkien's work, would not watch this in silence. Before we can continue our tale, we must acknowledge that there stands a challenger upon the field, ready to seize upon the arrogant upstart, soon to clash until only one could be left standing. Because before there were wizards, it was the time of dragons. The origin of our tale disappears into the mists of history. In ancient times, among the games that our ancestors played, it's believed even games of war existed. Archaeological digs in the sites of former civilizations frequently unearth representations of items that are believed to be pieces for war games. Information on them is scarce, even the possibility that we're completely wrong about it. So for that reason, while some assert that the game Go, aka Othello, is the first war game that we definitively know of, the first could probably be considered to be the ancient game of Chaturanga, as it is actually attempting to simulate war. Originating in ancient India, the game is quite reminiscent of chess, an 8x8 grid with two sides, both having 16 pieces, except it should be played on a board without alternating colors of the squares, instead having marks on certain ones. The image is not an accurate recreation in that regard. Note that this image is not of Chaturanga, despite repeated assertions. Rather, this is Chaturaji, a descendant of Chaturanga that was made for 4 players, and was very probably a game of chance. In Chaturanga, the pawns are the foot soldiers and take up the front row. In the back are the familiar arrangement of pieces: rooks, which were actually chariots, knights, which were horses, and others to protect the king. The bishop moved differently and was actually an elephant in this early version. And the queen also moved differently and was called the general or counselor, always positioned to the left of the king, rather than both kings being in the same column as in chess. Also in Chaturanga, the game ended when the king was captured, meaning that it could end when a player mistakenly moves it into what we call check today. It's easy to see how Chaturanga led to chess and the other games that evolved from Chaturanga to the east and to the west. Yet the game of chess has so descended into myth that many tales of its origins have come to light, all likely false. One is how a wise man invented it in order to have a queen understand that her last son had fallen in battle. Chess is war without bloodshed, he taught her. Another is that a different wise man created it to teach a selfish king, first, that every one of his people had value by first creating the game and playing it with him, and then to request as his fee that a grain of wheat be placed on each square, doubling the amount of the last each time, only for the king to realize there wasn't enough wheat in the entire kingdom to complete the task. The lesson here being that you mustn't presume that just because something is small, that losing it can be considered trivial. Other stories are similar and set the same idea. Chess is a game of wisdom, of intellect. And this remains so today. The allusions to chess are so common as to be unnoticed. To be someone's pawn, checkmate. To be a chess master, the endgame, stalemate, a gambit. Chess isn't just war without bloodshed. Chess is war for the intellectual, and mastery of it a sign of your mental fortitude. On the detective show Monk, after spending years showing the titular detective as a man of almost unparalleled genius despite his eccentricities, when Monk finally met a man smarter even than him, that man was a chess grandmaster. The first step in becoming chess happened in Persia around the 8th century, when the game became known as shatranj. The benefit of both timing and geography meant that it was ideal for the rise of Islam, which led to the game spreading from Persia to all other regions, although it should be noted that some authorities in the faith denounced the game despite this. Chess was likewise denounced by religious figures in Europe at times, despite the fact that in the 12th through 15th century it was quite popular with the aristocracy. A member of the clergy had to defend himself when he was accused of having played the game, stating the rather obvious fact that there's nothing particularly sinful about playing the game. But shockingly, despite its intellectual association, chess became a source of frustration for its association with lawlessness. People had begun gambling on games, and violence would break out. Attempts to go after chess were, like modern anti-gaming crusades, presuming the problem was the very nature of the game itself, rather than the fact that the people were behaving intolerably because of personality issues. Despite being an abstract game about war, if you stab someone because you lost your queen, the problem is with you, not with the game. Oh, speaking of losing a queen, let's skip ahead in our history to the 19th century, to the very real game of chess that was taking place between the nations of Europe. This will probably seem like a weird diversion, but don't worry, there's a reason why we're getting into the weeds here. In Spain, Isabella II ruled over an ever more disheartened populace thanks to his authoritarianism and the Queen's own scandals that undermined her rule. Things finally came to a head, and the Revolution of 1868 forced her to abdicate her throne. The revolutionary leaders wanted to set up a constitutional monarchy, and Juan Prim, Spain's de facto leader, worked with Otto von Bismarck, the Prime Minister of Prussia, to persuade a rather reluctant Prince Leopold to take the throne. But France was aghast at this, because you see, Prince Leopold was a member of the same line as the King of Prussia. France was having a problem, see, thanks in no small part to their leader, Emperor Napoleon III. He had a classic case of someone's talents being 90 degrees out of step with what their interests were. Napoleon found domestic affairs a tedious waste of his time, despite the fact that his domestic policies were highly successful. But he much preferred foreign policy, which he felt would further increase the international status of France and legitimize his own position as emperor. I don't want to get too far off the subject, so just to generalize it, Napoleon III's foreign policy in Europe frequently consisted of successful plots that he failed to capitalize upon, and unsuccessful plots that set back the national goals. But Bismarck, who ironically had evolved his political views thanks to his time as an ambassador to several major powers, including France, well, he returned to Prussia a seeming conservative, if not reactionary, on the outside. But his actions belied a man who understood the changes that were taking place in Europe at this time, and so exploited a loophole during a struggle between the throne and parliament, and took de facto control of Prussia's military and worked to strengthen it. His goal was a unified Germany under Prussian rule, and Napoleon III was delighted when Prussia and Austria went to war, fully expecting that, while Austria hated him, that in the end, Austria would win and Prussia would be defeated, leaving France in a much better position to control Central Europe. Instead, inexplicably, Prussia won the 7 Weeks' War, as it was called, severely altering the balance of power in Northern Europe, while domestically it led to conciliation from the liberal opponents of Bismarck because he was using his authority to advance German unity rather than specifically to strengthen the monarchy as they had feared. France was still the strongest nation on the continent, but Prussia's reversal of the expected outcome was a threat to her goals of continental foreign policy domination. So you see why France was very worried about Leopold, a relative of King William of Prussia, becoming King of Spain. If that were to happen, it means that Prussia effectively has them surrounded, on both the east and on the south. So the French made clear they were not going to stand for it. It hadn't happened yet. They still had the might to take their armies to Prussia and make trouble. So Prussia agreed to go along with it. They weren't going to put Leopold up. But Napoleon III couldn't take yes for an answer. France wanted to not just have them say that, but they wanted to have an audience with King William at which the king was to state that Prussia would never allow Leopold to be put up as a candidate. Well, the king wasn't going to do that. But he wanted to avoid an international incident, so very politely, he declined the audience. But Bismarck saw here a chess move that would be worthy of a grandmaster. He took the polite telegram meant to avoid upsetting the French and revised it so it was impolite and certain to upset the French. And then, a man ahead of his time, he leaked it. The slap across the face was an outrage to the French people, and Napoleon's generals saw it as provocation for a war that would undo their recent European failures and improve the emperor's own declining popularity. And besides, they said, the French army was second to none. They had a professional army that was universally armed with breech-loading chassepot rifles and an early form of machine gun. Why would Bismarck want to provoke such an army into attacking, huh? First, because he knew that if France were to attack any German territory, all of Germany would unite. They simply couldn't, with the recent history that had taken place, take a chance that France would simply stop once they had defeated Prussia. They might try to consume all of Germany. After all, the Germans were the ones who constantly paid every time the French marched east. Thus, by declaring war on Prussia, Napoleon III was handing Bismarck exactly what he wanted, a united Germany under Prussian leadership, and it increased the size of their army. It may not have been a professional army like the French had, but it still had more bodies to it. But second of all, Bismarck knew that despite how things might have looked to all those military experts in Paris, if France attacked Prussia, they would lose. Despite having superior weapons and seasoned soldiers, Prussia would bring in their superior numbers, a recognition of the importance of mobility, and their own secret weapon, something no one could have imagined would be as vital as it was. The Prussian military was commanded by a bunch of gamer geeks. You see, in 1664 in the city of Ulm, Christopher Weichmann felt that for all the talk about chess being war without bloodshed, that game clearly failed at properly simulating what battle was really like. Even if it ever did match, it was millennia out of date. Weichmann took it upon himself to create a new, more evolved version, which he called Königsspiel, King's Game. It had 30 pieces per side and had more modern units like halberdiers and marshals and couriers, and played on a board of more than 500 squares. He wasn't the only person to have this idea, of course, but his Königsspiel had real staying power. In fact, over a century later, it was still being played. But Johann Christian Ludwig Helwig, advisor to the Duke of Brunswick, built upon Königsspiel to create his game, given the mouthful name of Attempt to Build Upon Chess a Tactical Game which two or more persons might play. If you think the name is complicated, you can imagine how the game was. What was notable about the game was how it brought together three vitally important ideas. The first is aggregation, that is, using a single playing piece to represent a large military formation, like a battalion or a regiment or a brigade, rather than just as a single soldier or horseman. The second is it uses a board that has multiple colors to represent different types of terrain. Blue squares representing water, dark green for forests, and red for mountains, and so on. And the third is the introduction of an umpire-like third party that supervises the game and handles disputes. In 1797, Johann Georg Julius Venturini took it even further. He went for maximum realism. He increased Helwig's idea to 3,600 squares, and this time representing a 4-scale piece of real terrain, the border between France and Belgium. He also included something that was long missing in such games, an old military idea. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. It wasn't just about moving your units. You needed to be able to support your units, and so different figures were also created to represent them. Supply depots and supply wagons, plus fortifications were added and artillery. It was quite different to imagine that a rook could only go partway down the board because it didn't have a supply line to support going into the back rank of the opposing side. But he really wanted what he called Neue Kriegsspiel, new war game, to be like running a war yourself. He even included rules about movement based upon the weather in that particular season. In 1806, Johann Ferdinand Opitz of Austria created his own war game, intended for recreation, and had an innovation that others, including Helvig himself, scoffed at: the idea that in battle there was uncertainty. Things were never going to happen the same way every single time. So his game had an idea so revolutionary to wargaming, it seemed laughable. Dice. The idea that a military exchange could be thought of in terms of dice rolling was laughable to the serious wargamers. The next innovation came 6 years after that, when George Leopold Baron von Reitschwitz developed the game still further, by taking Vetterini's idea and dispensing with one of the last chess holdovers that had been in his game, the grid. Instead, he used a sand table along with sticks and string to represent the distance that units could move. This early version was seen by two princes who were so impressed they told their father, the king. Von Reitschwitz's son refined it even further by foregoing the sand table and instead using paper maps of terrain just like the actual maps that Prussian officers used. He also took Opitz's idea of using dice into the game to determine outcomes and casualties. And there was even the fog of war. The umpires would note each side's moves, but only put them on the map if the sides could see each other. The umpire also was the sole arbiter of victory. Rather than having to meet specific conditions, the umpire decided when one side or the other had won. Kriegspiel, as the game was called, was the final step needed to see that the move from abstract strategy like chess to true war simulation had finally arrived. General Karl von Mueffling was amazed and persuaded the king to issue a royal decree that every regiment get a copy of the game and play it regularly. However, as proof some things are timeless, the junior Reitschwitz was accused of having insulted his superiors and relocated away from Berlin in one of the provincial areas, where he was then subjected to such ridicule that he committed suicide just 3 years after Mueffling had been so impressed. The act blew back onto Kriegspiel, and the game itself fell into disfavor for a time, where it was now kept alive thanks to wargaming clubs. In fact, a year after his death, they released something so modern it almost sounds like a joke. The first Kriegspiel expansion. That's right, game expansions predate the telegraph. Helmuth von Moltke, often called Moltke the Elder to distinguish him from his nephew that commanded during World War I, was an ardent supporter of the game, and went on to become a field marshal of Prussia and finally the head of Prussia's military. Rather than having strong central control of the entire army during a battle, the techniques of Napoleon and Wellington, but now incompatible with the enormous armies that were being fielded, his idea was to have the pieces of it, their units, to understand the objectives of the battle so that they could spot and seize opportunities that developed instead of waiting for orders to come down from the marshal to tell them. In fact, he is the originator of the expression, "No plan survives contact with the enemy." The benefit of Kriegspiel was that the officers playing the game developed in the art of decision-making in rapidly changing circumstances and on the basis of limited information. It was thanks to his insistence that a peacetime general staff was needed to prepare what measures would be needed during war based upon their experience playing Kriegspiel, as well as using the game to create an officer corps that was trained to be tactically knowledgeable from their own personal experiences. And because of that, Moltke's Prussian military sought to win wars by employing the best officers rather than by needing to have the best soldiers, as contradictory as it might sound. But he followed the philosophy that was expressed, supposedly, by the Greek general Chabrias. An army of deer commanded by a lion is more to be feared than an army of lions commanded by a deer. His goal was to ensure that Prussia had nothing but lions leading his men into battle, and Kriegspiel was helping him do that. Moltka, Otto von Bismarck, and Albrecht von Roon were the great triumvirate, the latter being responsible for instituting organizational reforms and instituting a policy about military reserves and universal service. The victory over Austria in the 7 Weeks' War was no accident. Roon's reforms, combined with Moltke's recognition of the power of rail and his officer tactics, had allowed the underdog to win. The war that Napoleon III had encouraged had only allowed them to refine their techniques for the greatest challenge of all. Roon brought the soldiers, Moltka brought the leadership, and Bismarck brought the war. Napoleon swallowed the bait, thinking there was no way they could possibly lose. The result of this wasn't even David versus Goliath. It was David throwing down his slingshot, eating a can of spinach a la Popeye the Sailor, and proceeding to beat the living daylights out of Goliath with his bare hands. The experience of fighting war as a game over and over and over had paid off, with the leadership immediately knowing where to get their forces and how to get them there. The Germans moved 380,000 men to the front within 18 days, while the French arrived either late or undersupplied. When they engaged in battle, the Germans had the French on the ropes from the start, forcing retreat after retreat until the ultimate humiliation. Marshal Bazaine was forced back and eventually trapped at Metz. Marshal MacMahon, along with Napoleon III himself, brought his own forces in to aid the troops at Metz and to reverse the tide of the war. But despite his long and successful career in Constantinople, the Crimean War, Algeria, and during the Italian campaigns, even MacMahon was no match for the power that is fiercely determined nerds. Rather than backing up the forces at Metz, this army was encircled by German forces at Sedan on August 31, 1870. 2 days later, under brutal artillery bombardment, they were finally forced to surrender. 104,000 men, plus MacMahon and the Emperor himself. In deference to Chaturanga, the game that had led to Kriegspiel, the king had allowed himself to be captured. It was such a catastrophe that back in Paris the emperor was deposed, the new government tried and failed to mount a defense, and Marshal Bazaine eventually surrendered on behalf of France to Bismarck the following January. It was a move that so outraged France that they were sure none of this could possibly be happening. They sentenced him to death for his actions. Back home, the Prussian king was crowned as the emperor of a new unified German empire. French domination of Europe was ended forever, and even the terminology of politics now reflected it. Before Bismarck and Napoleon III, the French term raison d'etat was unified foreign policy for Europe. After their defeat, the German term Realpolitik described the new policy. The nations of the world watched as French ambitions were cut short by the Germans of all people, and realized the Prussian military was onto something. It wasn't the sole reason for victory, of course, but it was obvious this approach had equipped the Prussians with a highly trained officer corps that were ready to face numerous unexpected situations in battle, because they had done so time after time as a game. Wargaming spread throughout Europe and to the United States. An American by the name of Charles A. L. Totten, a lieutenant at the time, took what little they knew about Kriegspiel from British sources, along with knowledge of other war games, and created a U.S. Army game called Strategos, no relation to the later board game called Stratego. There was a basic version of it that played on a board and was closer to Helvig's update of Königspiel, not much like Kriegspiel itself. But this was just to help people learn. From there, the advanced version was much more like Kriegspiel, with the referee and the fog of war. In fact, the turn-based system centered upon the referee. It worked as follows. 1. Referee announces and records the beginning of a new interval, turn, and whether it is 1 minute or longer. 2. Referee notes the continuing effect and consequences of any action from previous turns. 3. Player commanders acting in turn state their orders, written if necessary, and intentions for this turn to the referee. 4. The referee and assistants execute all thus indicated moves that require no die rolling. They also note the dispatch of messengers or scouts, any initiation of fire, and the receipt of orders, messengers, and spies, etc. 5. The appropriate tables are consulted, and the related calculations are made in preparation of a die roll to determine whether the player commander's orders and intentions can in fact be implemented. 6. The dice are now rolled by the referee or by an assistant on the basis of the completed calculations and the appropriate table to determine which orders and or intentions can be effected. 7. The referee and assistants now implement as necessary any orders and or intentions determined by the die rolling to be possible, executing any movements now determined possible. 8. Losses due to distant fire are now calculated using the appropriate table and the losses recorded upon the playing pieces, or the pieces are removed whenever sufficient casualties or other results require it. 9. The chances for success in hand-to-hand combats beginning this turn or already in progress are now calculated by the referee and recorded. 10. Referee determines which ongoing hand-to-hand combats or rushes by units into hand-to-hand combat range end in this turn and identifies those clashes that will continue into the following turn. 11. Final victory or defeat in those hand-to-hand combats ending this turn is determined by the referee with a die roll and reference to the appropriate table. Pieces representing defeated units are turned face down and the defeat is recorded. 12. Losses in all hand-to-hand combats are now calculated and recorded on those playing pieces that remain in play, not removed from the table either as no longer effective or as destroyed. 13. All final results and consequences arising from this and previous turns are now affected and recorded, and those that will affect future turns are recorded. And finally, 14. Final corrections are called for, and the turn declared closed by the referee. Strategos was embraced by the War Department over the competing alternative, American Kriegspiel, which came out 2 years later. Although it's been noted that this might have been because Totten was an incorrigible name-dropper. Regardless, wargaming took root in America and would in fact play a substantial role in the U.S. Navy during World War II. At the Naval War College, wargaming was constantly taking place. And so when war did break out in the Pacific, the Japanese faced a Navy that had fought this war as a game over and over and over again. No, they didn't know exactly what Japan was going to do when they attempted to take control of the Pacific, but they knew almost everything that they might do, having played war games over and over and seeing all the possible ways things might go down in the Pacific theater. Anything Japan did, the Navy knew what their response needed to be. The one and only thing Japan ever did that the war games didn't predict were kamikaze attacks, but otherwise, the U.S. Navy had already faced and learned what to do in response to Japan's Pacific strategy. Chess's distant descendant had become what many had talked about it being, a simulation of battle. But while war games changed the nature of actual war, one person, a pacifist, wanted to enjoy the fun of it without the over-complexity and the too great dependency on realism that war games had now become. You might be surprised to learn it was none other than science fiction legend H.G. Wells. In 1913, Wells shared his game with the world, although to be clear, it's not the way you might think. He didn't release a game in a box. Rather, he wrote a book about it. See, at the time, tin soldiers and tiny cannons that fired little projectiles were cheap, commonplace toys, and Wells had taken to turning them into a game with his children. So he wrote the details of his game in a book called Little Wars, a far simpler game than Kriegspiel and other games. What was particularly notable was the absence of using dice and/or mathematics to determine the consequences of attack. It was down to your skill in aiming and firing your miniature cannon. You hit or you didn't. That's all there ever was. Little Wars did several important things. First, it brought wargaming back to its pleasure roots, and many consider it the father of all miniature wargaming today. Second, it showed the flexibility that could be employed in the interpretation of rules and the degree of realism of the game. It could be an intricate map with running trains and meticulously painted buildings, or it could be simple stand-ins that used your imagination. Third, it brought wargaming back to the masses with an inexpensive way to play. One of the reasons that some refinements to German wargames had taken place were the sets were so expensive, people were, kit bashing their own. And finally, and very important, Wells illustrated that there is a strong division between a game and the thing that game simulates. In fact, he made the point that Little Wars showed the pointlessness of great wars. He would have scoffed had a late 20th, early 21st century critic condemned him for advocating war and violence the way that it happens during our lifetime. We do things in our imagination that we would never do for real because nobody gets hurt. On the Little Wars battlefield, you can blast men with cannons with a clear conscience, even if you would never fire one even as a warning shot for fear you might hurt someone by accident. It may surprise you to learn that Wells wasn't the only science fiction author to go in this direction. Fletcher Pratt, who also wrote detective works and fantasy, had an interest in history as well, especially the Civil War, and was a military analyst for both the New York Post and Time magazine. But his passion for naval ships led him to create sets of rules for naval wargaming. Much like Wells, you built your own ships for the games. Much of the fun in miniature games is this sense of creation, painting the figures yourself or building the terrain and the other aspects of it. However, in 1953, a new direction was offered for hobby wargaming thanks to Charles Roberts. He created a game called Tactics, which used a paper map and cardboard squares, rather than the models and figures normally employed in hobby wargaming. These counters represented a unit type and had stats for that unit. Starting in 1954, he self-published the game as Avalon Game Company by mail order. Tactics offered several positives that couldn't be found in other war games: a low cost, easy setup, and it required less space to play. What it did was fuse the existing wargaming with board games to create the war board game. And interestingly, didn't require knowledge of history in order to play it. It was just a battle between two hypothetical nations. In 1958, he changed the name of the company to Avalon Hill and began selling an updated version of his original, called Tactics 2, along with Dispatcher and the big hit Gettysburg. By 1962, Avalon Hill had already become the fourth largest producer of board games in the United States, in part because Roberts also branched out to allow non-war games as well. Dispatch was a railroad simulator, and the following year's Verdict was made, appropriately, by a pair of lawyers. Wargaming clubs were growing around the country. One of the largest was Midwest Military Simulation Association, which was located in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. Among those present at its first meeting was a teen by the name of David Wesley. Now, over the course of our history, we've seen wargaming branch. On one branch was to try to simulate battle as accurately as possible, with the intention of being better prepared for actual battle to take place. On the other branch is the desire to experience wargaming purely for the pleasure of the simulation, the same way that chess and chaturanga had been. At the MMSA, thanks to David Wesley rediscovering Strategos, those two branches converged. There was a Strategos revival. People were excited at the opportunity to be able to play a war game made to actually simulate battle as accurately as possible. But more than that was that Strategos was the answer to a problem that they'd been facing but hadn't had a solution to because the solution was on the wrong branch of history. All these great games had rules to them, but there's a difference between having a rule and understanding exactly how that rule is supposed to work. Interpreting the rules was left up to individuals, and they had fierce arguments breaking out over what a rule meant. But the other branch of wargaming had solved this centuries ago, because it needed to. If you're going to have an accurate simulation of battle, you can't have people cheating. So, they realized that this was exactly what they needed, not just for Strategos, but for all of their war games. They needed to have an all-powerful, impartial referee there to make sure the rules were fairly followed. So, that was a great advancement for wargaming here. We not only had our branch, wargaming for fun, but we also had a chance to be introduced to a classic, real wargame simulator. Win-win. What more could you ask for? Well, it planted the seed for an idea for David Wesley that would create a third branch. Meanwhile, in neighboring Wisconsin, an avid wargamer was making a name for himself. And it was a very memorable name, too. Gary Gygax. A lifelong lover of all games, what really hooked him on wargaming was Avalon Hill's Gettysburg. Gygax had a beautiful wife named Mary Jo and eventually had 5 children. But when she was pregnant with her second child, she was convinced Gygax was having an affair. But instead of finding a secret lover in their basement, she found that her husband was poring over maps and working on game development. Gygax was obsessed with gaming. The United States Continental Army Command, for all the grandeur of its title, was a play-by-mail wargaming club created by Bill Spear. Its successor organization, though, was the International Federation of Wargaming, intending to be a more mature version of the wargaming hobby and to promote the hobby through information and publication. In 1967, Spear arranged for a gaming convention in Malvern, Pennsylvania, to be financed by a prepaid dinner. But unfortunately, not enough people attended the dinner, so the convention was underfunded and the organization had to foot the bill. Discouraged, Spear had no plans to do another convention. But Gygax had liked it, so much so that the following year he ran another convention. But since most of their members were in the Midwest, and there was that huge Midwest Military Simulation Association in nearby Minnesota, he kept it in his hometown of Lake Geneva, and he called it Gen Con, short for Geneva Convention, as well as being a con that is held in Lake Geneva. 96 people attended what was to be the first of Gygax's annual Gen Cons. Only 1/3 were actually members of the IFW. It not only had succeeded as a convention, in fact the following year it would almost double in number of people attending, but it allowed several introductions to take place in the wargaming community. You'd have had no idea that back home Gygax had more problems than a wife concerned with sleeping around. Gygax had been an insurance underwriter, but he lost his job. He seized the opportunity to work in gaming, supplemented by his unemployment checks and a job doing, of all things, shoe cobblery out of his home. But the same year as Gen Con, Gygax began creating his own published games, starting with Little Bighorn, about General Custer's famous Last Stand. Many more games quickly followed, but the biggest one was Chainmail, made for Guidon Games. They had worked out precise rules for a medieval-style combat game, including man-to-man fighting and ideas like jousting. But what was the truly vital part of Chainmail, what springs it from a footnote in wargaming history and into the limelight, was Appendix E, where Gygax proceeded to go mad. At this point, I need to stop and address something rather important. In some cases, Gygax is a saint, or at the very least, to be taken as a paragon to geek culture. In his book Of Dice and Men, David Ewalt frequently uses analogous phrases to deep religious experiences related to Gygax. And while it probably should be taken that, as a gamer, he's likely infusing things with a creative narrative sense, that nevertheless would be a very consistent view with how he is perceived by many. However, Gygax has also been vilified by many for a variety of issues that we will get into, including that he hyped up his role in the origin of Dungeons & Dragons to take undue credit for its creation. As with my look at George Lucas, my intention is to go in without an agenda, to see him as a man and neither paragon nor villain, to see where events take us. But for that reason, I think that we need to emphasize how visionary Appendix E was. Also called the Fantasy Supplement, this added to the war game a truly bizarre option: how to incorporate fantasy elements into a chainmail game. Now, obviously, there existed speculative fiction-based wargaming, but it was specifically about those kinds of things. What they were doing was taking a game that was very much about medieval combat and then throwing fantasy into it, on top of it, as an addition to it somehow. Just imagine for a moment if at the end of the chess book you were told that in certain iterations the rook could fire a catapult to kill a distant piece without having to move. Or even more bizarrely, that a bishop was permitted, instead of making a move, to launch an ice spell that would freeze an opposing piece for so many turns so it couldn't move. Heresy, right? Yet Gygax had given chainmail rules for things like elves and hobbits, 8 types of spells, and magic swords and the like. Contrary to what many have asserted, chainmail was not a prototype D&D. It was a war game still. It just happened to be one where the fantasy had been added into an otherwise straight war game. What happened, though, was that someone took 2 bizarre extremes of wargaming: the highly realistic, history-shaping type of strategos, and Gygax's crazy idea bringing magic and fantasy into specialized number-crunching combat scenarios, and to eventually create a fusion that would transform gaming in ways no one could possibly have imagined. Ironic, considering how vital imagination would be to this game.